thanks for joining me today for episode 39 of Podcasting Your Brand. I'm your host, producer Jaime, providing learning lessons for you to podcast your brand. And today I'm going to share part 1 of this next series of episodes, the technical side of launching, where I'll cover with you your equipment and getting connected for remote recordings. This episode is brought to you by my own brand, Flintstone Media. Listen in and let's do this. Hello, and welcome back to the show. I hope that the prelude to this series, which was the last episode, episode 38, gave you a good, solid overview of the technical side of launching. And I presented it in 8 main steps. Well, over these next 4 episodes, I'll be diving deeper into the details of those 8 steps, starting today with the first 2 steps, getting your equipment, the hardware side, and getting connected for remote recordings, the software side. Now, I'm going to come at this from as much of an evergreen standpoint as humanly possible, so I won't be naming specific equipment models. I'm also avoiding specific models because everyone has a different budget available to get started with. As such, I think you can really mess with people, especially if you're a newbie podcaster with a hobbyist budget. And I don't want to push a message that makes you think you can only be successful with very specific equipment. I mean, I started what is now a very successful career in podcasting with a $20 stick mic pulled off of a Best Buy shelf. So I don't want to push a message like that and either A, cause you to spend more than you can comfortably afford to get started with, or B, get discouraged from starting at all because you can't afford this model or that model that I recommend. So rather, I'm going to explain the type of equipment you need in different situations so you can make the most informed decision for you, including based on your budget. And I put a link to my equipment guide in this episode's show notes and every episode's show notes, really. And over time, I'll keep that guide updated so that no matter when you're finding this episode and looking at it, or you stumble across that guide some other way, that link will always open the most current version of my equipment guide. So you can click on that link now and have it in front of you while you're listening to the rest of this episode, or take a look at it later, whatever. But that resource will be there for you whenever you are ready for it. All right, so let's dive deeper into the equipment you need, starting with your microphone. As mentioned in the prelude, unless you have incredible control over the environment you're recording in, your best bet is to get a dynamic microphone rather than a condenser microphone. Let me explain why. Essentially, a condenser microphone is designed to pick up the whole room. So it's made to pick up the sound from various directions within the space and to be very sensitive to capturing sound that's not right next to it. Condenser mics are great for lots of scenarios, but podcasting is rarely one of them. When podcasting, you don't want to pick up the sound of your dog chewing its chew toy in the corner, or my cat's playing with the blinds as they are right now, or your neighbor mowing the lawn. You don't want that. Instead, you want a dynamic microphone, which is designed to pick up what is right in front of it, your voice. And you want to make sure that you have a separate microphone for each of you if you have a co-host. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, so we'll swing back around to that in a minute. But I'm going to go through right now some typical recording scenarios, and which scenario applies to you is based on the needs of the format of your show. So the format you chose to create your show around will determine if you have a co-host, have a solo versus a guested show. If you have guests, are you meeting them in person to record or recording remotely? Does your show call for a mobile setup like my old travel adventure show Finding Florida did? I'm going to keep mentioning it because it was a great show. But that scenario will actually be covered on a future episode because it is its own beast. But okay, back to your show. What format your show is going to be leads to the needs you have in order to capture that sound, which then leads to the equipment that you need, which is where we find ourselves now. So I'll go through different scenarios, starting first with a show where you are the only host and you have no guests. This is, of course, going to be the most simple scenario. You'll need a dynamic microphone, and you want to be able to plug it directly into your computer. So that would mean needing it to connect via a USB port. And as an extra note, most mics that have a USB connector are fitted to plug into a standard USB port, the rectangular shaped ones. So you want to double check what kind of USB ports your computer has. Some, mainly Macs, have the USB ports that are more rounded. Those are USB-C ports. So you'll need to be sure to also order a USB to USB-C adapter. But thankfully, those are only a few extra bucks. And I have an example in my equipment guide in case you need a reference. So it's really easy. Just double check your ports. But once you have your mic plugged into your computer, you'll then want to check your system's sound input settings to be sure that your computer system is set to pick up the sound from your USB mic rather than your computer's built-in microphone, which will not sound anywhere near as good. And if you record that way, congratulations! You just wasted your money on your dynamic microphone because you're not even using it. So you definitely need to check that your computer is using your USB mic. Depending on whether you have a Mac or a PC, you'll find your sound settings in different ways. So if you're not familiar with where in your computer to find your sound settings, go ahead and Google for the info or search a video for it on YouTube. But once you've found your computer's sound settings, what you're going to look for is that your input settings are set to your USB mic. There should be a list to choose from or a drop down or something like that. And your USB mic will only show up as an option once it's plugged in and turned on. So be sure it's plugged in and turned on. Then look for mic or input option that says USB, or it may even be labeled with your microphone's model number, but that's the option you want to choose. And you'll want to be sure to double check that you've chosen correctly and your computer is picking up your USB mic each and every time you sit down to record. I repeat, you want to check that you've chosen this correctly and that your computer is picking up your USB mic each and every time you sit down to record. And not for nothing, but you also need to make sure that your mic is on. Trust me, it still happens to even us seasoned podcasters. In fact, it happened to me the other day. I was hosting a live event. In that case, it was the wireless mic and the batteries died, but whatever. I should have checked before I started talking. But yeah, check to make sure your mic is on before you start recording. Next, whether with a guest or a co-host, if you have another voice to add to the mix, you need a way to record an extra sound source, which adds a little more complexity into your setup, but no worries, nothing you can't handle. If you're connecting with them remotely, firstly, and to the best of your ability, also have them using a dynamic microphone on their end rather than their computer's internal mic. But then you need a way to connect with them. And as mentioned in the Prelude episode, there are a lot of options nowadays. In order to keep this evergreen, I'll share a quick current list, but it may well be worth it for you to do a quick search to find what might be best for you when you discover this episode and are putting together the tech for your show. New tools are being created in the podcasting space all the time, which is a very good thing. You just want to make sure you have all the current options available to you. But StreamYard is my current favorite. It wasn't even created with straight podcasting in mind. It's actually a tool for live broadcasts like Facebook or LinkedIn Lives, that sort of thing. But the reason I like it so much for podcasting is because the quality is really good. You don't have to go live with it, even though that's what it was created for. You can just use it to record. Plus, there are a lot of extra bells and whistles, like being able to have graphics on the screen or some other cool visual tools. And you can also have other participants on wait in a backstage green room type thing. So you can then control who's brought in and out of the conversation. So you can really play with the format of your show in that way too. So all of that is really, really cool. Then two options that were created with podcasting in mind are Zencaster and Squadcast. So you want to take a look at those as well. And a lot of podcasters also choose to use Zoom simply because so many people are already familiar with it. So it can be really comfortable as an option for your guests. But to be quite honest, the sound quality isn't the best. I mean, Zoom was meant for meetings, not for content creation. So just keep that in mind. And as a last mention, I'll suggest something many would find quite surprising. Skype. Okay, don't turn this off yet. There's a reason. Reason. So first note, the reason if you're familiar with Skype and you might be rolling your eyes is because Skype's sound quality has never been that great, but it has been steadily improving over the years. So that's a good thing. But the reason why it may be an option to keep in your back pocket is that as of now, Skype is the only connection software that I'm aware of that can be used to call a phone number. So if a cell phone call or a landline call is the only way your guests can connect, which is often true when we are doing recording sessions for Horse Radio Network, then Skype is the option you'll have to go with. So it's still on my list for that reason. But whatever software tool you use, learn it. That's the most important thing. Watch some tutorials, discover what you don't know, find the controls that affect your sound quality, etc., etc. All right, this next bit of information is super important. The topic of headphones. As soon as you bring another person into the mix, whether a guest or a co-host, headphones are critically essential. And you don't want headphones that have their own mic attached, at least not generally speaking, because it can confuse your system. I'm talking about just straight up plug them right into the headphone port headphones, okay? Just simple headphones. In a nutshell, here's what generally happens when you and the other person don't use headphones, and it's a podcast killer. What happens is when you speak, your voice then comes out of their computer speakers because it has no other route with no headphones plugged in. With no other option, your voice will come out of the computer speakers on their side of the remote connection. And why is that a big deal? Well, because when your voice comes out of their computer speakers, it then gets picked back up by their microphone. And that bleed back causes an echo effect, and it just kills your recording. So you have to use headphones. So plug them in and then check your computer's output settings. Once again, you'll need to go into your computer sound settings, so be sure you know where those are. But rather than looking at how your voice is being picked up, which would be your input settings, you're going to instead be checking your output settings, how the sound is leaving your computer and going back out for you to hear it. So when you look at your list of output options, often you'll see something labeled Realtek. Those are your computer speakers and not what you want, okay? You don't want that. Instead, choose either something labeled as clearly as saying headphones or that names the model or brand of your headphones. Select that, and you should now hear everything coming through your headphones rather than your computer speakers. Voila! You're all set. Now, if you have a co-host who you are remotely connecting to, and there are also guests in the mix that you're remotely connecting to, then rather than two people connecting remotely, it then becomes three or more. But otherwise, the setup is not really that different. It just multiplies. And on a future episode, I'll be going through a bunch of tips for making the most out of recording remotely. So you want to be sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss that future episode. But for now, I'll have a link in the show notes to not only my equipment guide, but also to my tips for handling audio issues during remote recordings. So look for that resource in the show notes right now as well. And since I've now explained both your computer's input and output settings, I want to pause for a moment to share another very important note. There's an order to things. And if you are connecting remotely to either a co-host or a guest, then you want to be sure to check both your input and your output settings before you record. However, I've only addressed half the effort. But at least it's the first part of the effort, checking your computer's inputs and outputs. You want to do this first because your computer sound settings are essentially the master settings for the system. But when you're connecting to do a remote session, then the software program you're using to connect through also has its own set of settings. So you check your computer's sound settings first. Again, those are the master settings, but then also check the sound settings for your software, Zoom, StreamYard, Zencastr, whatever. They also have a setting for your input and your output. So check these next, making sure the software is also set to pick up your USB mic as the input and your headphones as the output. Or you may see a same as system option, which you can also select. And it's essential to do it in that order. Your computer system settings first, then your software settings. Okay, let's talk about in-person recordings. Because if you and your guest or co-host are together in the same space, then how you set things up needs to be done a bit differently. As previously mentioned, you definitely want separate mics. In fact, this is so important that let's say you and your co-host have a microphone budget of $100, it will be much better to get two $50 microphones than to try to share one $100 microphone and huddle close to it or something. Now, here's where it gets a bit tricky, because even if your computer has more than one USB port, you don't want to try plugging in both mics into the same computer. It will confuse the heck out of it, and your sound inputs can get all wonky. So this is where a mixer comes in. And a mixer can seem intimidating. I'll admit it. I was intimidated by mixers at first, but let me break it down so it's super, super simple for you. The mixer plugs into your computer rather than your microphones plugging directly into your computer. And then the mixer then acts as a hub for taking in sound from various sources, controlling how it's then fed to your computer for recording and to your headphones for listening. So plug the mixer into your computer. And as before, you want to be sure the mixer you choose can connect via USB to your computer and that you order the USB to USB-C adapters if needed. Then add in all your sound sources, starting with the microphones. You'll have one mic for each of you, as mentioned, and they'll plug into your mixer separately. So when choosing a mixer, you need to be sure it has enough mic ports to accommodate the needs of your show. And this is a very important note. If you're using a mixer in your setup, rather than having mics that plug directly into your computer, you'll need mics that plug into the mixer. So instead of dynamic microphones that connect via USB, I know it's starting to get really nerdy, but just bear with me. Instead of dynamic microphones that connect via USB, like I've been talking about so far, you'll need dynamic mics that connect to your mixer. And that is almost certainly going to instead be via XLR cords, not USB. So again, make sure you check the fine print before you buy your mics to be sure that they can connect as you need them to, either USB or XLR. And an XLR connection is something you may have actually seen before, even if you don't recognize the terminology. It's the kind of cord you find for a stage mic, for example. It connects with a big rounded end with these three little pins in it. So you'll get dynamic mics with XLR connections and plug them into your mixer with XLR cords. Next, I'm going to harp on it again. You'll need a separate set of headphones for all the same reasons I mentioned before. And same with mics. There will be a separate port for each of your headphones. So check the fine print to make sure the mixer you choose can accommodate the number of headphones you'll need to plug in. Now, there may be some other elements to your mixer that are worth a quick mention. Firstly, the faders. These are buttons that slide up and down on a number scale and control how loudly each sound source is being brought into the system. In other words, the volume of the microphones, for example. So start with these somewhere in the middle of the scale for any faders that are live mics being used. For any empty ports or mics that are not being used, push these faders all the way down to completely deaden them. But if you can't hear someone, there's a good chance their fader is down, or someone talks very softly like this, very softly. You can bring their fader up higher to match everyone else's voice level. And if you're also recording someone who is connecting remotely via software, then their volume is being brought in and controlled by a fader labeled for the USB connection. So if you can't hear someone coming in through Zoom or whatever, check that the fader is up for the USB connection. Second are the volume knobs. These control how loudly the sound that's coming into the mixer is then put out to each set of headphones. So similar to unused microphone ports, turn down the knobs of any unused headphone ports to deaden them too. But then each person can set their own headphone volumes as they'd like. And there may be a master volume control knob that is able to turn up and down everyone's volume. So if you can't hear someone, it could be that their mic fader is down, your individual headphone volume knob is down, the master volume knob is down, they are connecting in remotely, and your USB fader is down, or their mic itself is off. Now, there are a lot of other elements to a mixer, especially if it has digital controls and all these kinds of things that you can really, really dig into. But what I've mentioned here are the most important and fairly universal parts and functions of a mixer to get you well on your way. And as a final note, when setting up the mics for an in-person, multi-person session, have the back ends of the mics facing each other so that the front of the mics, the heads of the mics, face away from each other. Essentially, you want each mic to be able to focus on that particular person's voice and nothing else. So spread out around the table, or if on the same side of the table, orient yourselves so that you are facing each other, which causes the mics to face away from each other and only face one person at a time. And if a mixer isn't in your budget quite yet, but you're going to be recording with someone in the same space, no worries. You still have two other options. The first is using a mobile setup, which I'll be detailing on a future episode as I keep mentioning. But alternatively, if you want to still record with a computer, or you have to record with a computer because you need to still bring in a third party remotely via Squadcast or Zoom or whatever, then what I would then recommend is honestly just pretending you're in different locations anyway. Each plug your own mic into your own computer, be in different rooms to avoid sound bleed and echo if at all possible, and then just use the remote connection software to connect. And regardless of whether you're recording remotely or in the same location, whether you have separated systems or are linked into a mixer, either way, please, for the love of all that's holy, headphones. Okay, we have covered a lot. I told you that I would dive a lot deeper into each of these steps when I gave the rundown on the last episode, so you were fairly warned. But there are just a few more quick items I want to note for you on this episode covering equipment and connecting for remote recordings. First, no matter what your tech needs end up being, you'll want to complete your setup with a windscreen, which is the foam ball covering you often see on the head of a microphone. Long story short, it helps cut down on some breath sounds and any other source of moving air. Now, it's not a miracle worker, it's just foam, but it makes quite a difference. Also, a pop filter. This is a piece of fabric typically held taut between a circular frame and is positioned between your mouth and the microphone. Pop filters cut down on hard P noises called plosives. It's not really important what they're called. Just know they are pretty distracting to a listener. So a pop filter really, really helps. And you can find a windscreen and a pop filter each for just a few bucks. I've included examples in my equipment guide. And last but not least is a stand to hold your microphone. When using tabletop stands, I prefer ones that are adjustable so you can raise the mic to the level of your mouth rather than having to crouch down to meet it, which can affect your voice and your posture and your back pain, etc., etc. And alternatively, and what I've used now for years and love, is a boom arm for my microphone. These tend to be a few extra dollars, to be fair, but you can still get one pretty cheap, and I absolutely love mine because boom arms minimize and almost eliminate any sound from hitting the desk or the table that you're recording at. And those taps, even the little ones, can really be picked up by the microphone. So I prefer to keep my mic off my desk completely by having a boom arm, which attaches to the side of my desk, and I can bring my mic toward me exactly as it is most comfortable. And remember, so as to not completely overwhelm you with the content of this episode, I'm going to include a link in the show notes to my list of tips for handling sound issues. So whether it's a strange buzzing sound or a connectivity issue, refer to the link in the show notes, download that sheet, and keep it handy. And my final note, test. Do a test recording before you record for real. And I mean every time. After nearly 10 years doing this, I can tell you the gremlins are real. They may not look like the ones in the movies, but gremlins are real. And every system gets randomly attacked by them. And you never know when your system will be the next victim. And you don't want to figure out there's a problem after recording a really amazing podcast. That is the worst. So always test, especially after you get new equipment, especially after moving your equipment around, breaking it down to move it from place to place or whatever, but really every time. And if you're having issues, check everything, because the gremlins could be in the mic, the cord, your mixer, your ports, your software, your internet connection. Like really, they could be anywhere lurking about. So you want to be sure to do a quick test recording before recording for real. And on a future episode, remember that I'll go through the technical setup you'll need for a mobile show like we had for Finding Florida. I promise. But coming up on the next episode, episode 40, I'll take a deeper dive into steps 3 and 4 of the technical side of launching, recording, and your space. By the way, the your space part of the episode will be me finally delivering on the subject of the where of your show. Woohoo! We covered in the first series of episodes the who, the how, the why, the when, and I promised eventually to get to the where. So that's coming up on the next episode. And remember that you can meet me on the Owl app for one-on-one call about your podcasting questions anytime I go live. So watch for me there. Owl is spelled with 2 W's and 2 L's. But until then, I have a whole host of free tips for you on my website. Just check out flintstonemedia.com/free tips. Thanks for tuning in for Podcasting Your Brand. In this show, I'm revealing how you can harness the power of podcasting to expand your brand. So come and pick up what I've been putting down since 2014. Avoid common mistakes and propel your podcasting and branding forward. And if you have any questions or are interested in becoming a sponsoring brand of this show, do not be shy. Reach out to me at Jaime, spelled Jaime, at flintstonemedia.com. It's producer Jaime signing off for now. Remember, the only thing more powerful than your voice is your spirit to use it. So turn that mic on.